Well, thank you for having me. I don't know how I tricked myself into this job, where I just run around the world and study fuzzy animals and then hang out in 7 cool places. So I've done something right, or just tricked the right people. So yeah, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for having me. So this is Carol. And Carol has a lot of problems, from failing septic tanks, to researchers partying too loud, to the loss of federal funding. But Carol also has a lot of friends, and so Carol can solve these problems, which is great. And this is the story seen across all mammals. Carol is not unique. I love you, Carol. You're not unique. It's seen across the animals, where more friends and more close friends help solve problems and increases longevity and survival and reproductive success, what we call fitness, and you'll hear me use that throughout this talk. All the things that matter in the wild. More friends, which is good. And much like Carol, marmots have a lot of problems to solve, from predators to hotter summers, variable timing, seasonal events are changing, like the emergence from hibernation, when their food comes up, and they're experiencing harsher winters during hibernation. And so much like Carol, marmots have friends to help them deal with these problems, like looking for predators and staying warm during hibernation. But unlike all of these other mammals that experience mostly positive benefits from increased individual sociality, marmots are weird. So marmots experience mostly costs from having more friends and having closer friends. And so marmots are really the outlier in all of these mammals. So what gives? And this evening, that's the question I want to explore. Why are marmots so darn weird? And why has this marmot sociality evolved? And where may the benefits of marmot sociality come from? So before we do that, let's step back. What even is a marmot? Well, they're large ground squirrels. Just like the squirrels maybe you see running around your backyard, marmots are also a squirrel, which means they're in the rodent family. And there's about 15 species, or there are 15 species of marmots in the globe, with some species living alone and some species living together. And so in North America, we have 6 species, including one very famous marmot species, a marmot so famous it has its own national holiday. And so groundhogs, found predominantly on the East Coast and through the Midwest, are indeed marmots. And so Groundhog Day is Marmot Day. And now I'm partial for marmots, but I'm also partial for animal behavior, as you're about to learn. And Groundhog Day is really the only national holiday about animal behavior. It's about when a marmot wakes up. Now they artificially wake it up, but we're going to ignore that part. The marmot wakes up and we celebrate animal behavior. And so yes, marmots are also those pesky buggers that get into everything, under your house, in your car, and if you're like me, they eat everything in your car, so nothing works. And so if this is also you, we can commiserate after this talk and share tips and tricks. And so of the 6 marmot species in North America, the one I study is the yellow-bellied marmot, or for you Latin nerds, Marmota flavorventer. Hereby, I'm just going to call them marmots. And so these marmots are found throughout the American West and a little bit in the southern Canadian Rockies, even though whoever made this map doesn't like Canada, so they didn't put them there. And so these marmots are also what we have right here in the Sierras. And so while I may have studied them in Colorado, we're going to act like I'm talking about the ones in our backyard. And so these marmots are harem polygynous, which means one male runs around and tries to control as many adult females as they can. Sounds very human. And then they're also obligate winter hibernators. So if you ever see a marmot in the dead of winter, that is a very confused and distraught marmot. And then they're also facultatively social, which means they're found in a wide variety of group sizes and sometimes alone. And the marmot annual cycle is essentially wake up, reproduce, get fat, and go back to sleep. And so most individuals disperse away after the year they're born. So you're born a pup, and then you go down for hibernation where you were born. You wake back up, you'll be a yearling, and right before that season's pups come up, your parents will kick you out. And 90+% of them disperse. And they're cross rivers, they're climb mountains, they're hitches rides in your car from Colorado to Arizona. Yes, that happened. We can talk about that later. And so essentially how I describe the marmot life history is get fat or die. And Get Fat or Die is so important. When I finally made every kid's dream come true, I get featured and profiled in National Geographic. This is the first quote they chose. So either I made the Nat Geo writer mad, or it's that important that Get Fat or Die is the whole ethos if you're a marmot. And so we study a population at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, which is this incredible biological field station, much like SNARL, except located in western Colorado, north of Crested Butte, south of Aspen, if you're familiar. And we've been studying them there annually since 1962. And so in the last 60 plus years, we have over 4,600 unique individuals we've marked, over 200,000 behavioral observations, and we've spent too many hours, I'm surprised we've counted that much, in time spent in the field watching these marmots do what they do. And so this actually makes the Rumble Marmot Project the second longest running project on free-living mammals in the world, second only to Jane Goodall. And if I'm gonna come second, it's a good person to come second to. And so you're probably asking, how do we study these marmots? And how do we understand marmot social behavior? Well, we do what we call marmoteering. And so for 5 days, for 5 months, 6 days a week, often twice a day, we go out and we observe and we trap these animals. And so we collect a lot of data. And so during this, we mark all the individuals and take a suite of physiological, hormonal, health, and genetic data. And then we also take a suite of behavioral data. So we know who's where, who's interacting with who's initiating and who's receiving those interactions. So we know what predators are around, and we can collect a little bit about the environmental conditions. And so this long-term data set, I am not 60, in case you were wondering. I have not been collecting this data from 1962. Many people have had to be a part of this project. It's the emergent product of many that came before, including Ken Armitage, who started the project in 1962, and then my PhD advisor, and Dan Blumstein, who's the current project director. And some of the work I'm presenting comes from this incredible group of people, including a number of undergraduates I mentored in the field and in the lab who helped produce a lot of this data. And so these yellow-bellied marmots experience a wide variety of social behaviors, from sitting together, looking for predators, to greeting each other, to allo grooming, to foraging together, to playful biting, and to all-out tackling each other. And so with this variety of social behaviors that we go out 6 days a week, twice a day for 5 months and watch and record, we can begin to construct their marmot social networks. No, not these social networks, though I would love to see what a marmot would tweet. I'm talking about these social networks, social network analysis, where lines between individuals represent a social interaction. It's a really simple way to quantify a really complex thing. And so if there's any network nerds like me in the audience, all the networks I'm going to talk about today are of affiliative behaviors, which are all those friendly, fun, playful behaviors we just saw, and that makes up 88% sum of all their social behaviors. And the networks are weighted and directed and only include yearlings and adults, and they're based on space use overlap. If there's any network nerds that made sense to you, everybody else, which is okay, it's me too. And so these social networks, we can ask not just how many social partners an individual has, or how frequent those interactions are, with a thicker line representing more frequent interactions, but we can ask who's directing social interactions to who, because me walking up to George Clooney and asking for his autograph is very different than George Clooney walking up to me and asking for my autograph. And we can also ask about which individuals are connected, so which one of my friends are connected to my friends. And then we can ask about an individual's social position within their larger group, incorporating both their direct and their indirect social partners. And so with this decades-long study of all things marmot and the social network analysis as our tool and as our guide, we can finally start to ask the question, why are marmots weird? So first, we know that marmots, individuals and marmot groups, are socially variable. So they come in a wide variety of group sizes. And so individuals may be more or less connected or isolatable, and groups vary in their structure and their connectivity within and between years. And while these are small examples of marmot groups, they can get as large as 30 or 40 individuals. That's less common, and they have quite smaller social groups, usually around a dozen. And so marmots are socially variable, but what are some of the things that drive this variance? And so as you all know, I need not mansplain to you that living in the mountains, the summers and the winters are very stark, they're very different. And that's why marmots are a seasonal hibernator. And with seasonal hibernation, the timing and the length of events could drive social behavior along with all sorts of other things. And this is particularly interesting to study because climate change is a mixed bag for marmots. Climate change is resulting in longer summers, which is more time to eat and get fat before hibernation, so you have more body mass for a shorter winter, except winter snowpacks are becoming more variable. They're becoming not as thick and they're becoming a little more wet, which is not making it a good blanket. So even if you have a really long summer to get really, really fat, if your blanket sucks, you're gonna have a hard winter. And so studying the environmental impacts and how that influences social behavior is really quite an interesting question. And so my former rockstar student, Carla, asked this question about seasonal length and timing in marmot social behavior. And so on both of our vertical y-axes, we're gonna have a social network measure degree. That's just how many social partners you have, how many friends. And then we found, I've broken this. So Carla found a positive relationship between degree and winter length. And so that's saying that marmots had more social relationships after a longer winter hibernation. And this could be because after a longer winter, more of your body mass is depleted, requiring more time out of your burrow, running around, interacting with others, looking for food, and that leads to social interactions. We also found a negative relationship between degree, so the number of friends you have, and the timing of winter's end and the spring's beginning. And so that is the longer there is snow on the ground in the spring, the less social partners individuals have. And that might be because when snow's on the ground, marmots aren't outside their burrows eating and interacting as much, but they're spending more time in their burrows where we can't see them, and I have no idea what they're doing. And so given climate change is making environmental conditions more random, and it's driving these mismatches in when seasons begin and how long they are, especially at high elevation, studying these populations of marmots at Rumble in Colorado, here in Mammoth, is super important and is a relationship we want to understand. So that's the marmot's external environment, but what about the marmot's internal environmental drivers? And so in humans, we know the diversity and composition of the gut microbiome drives our social behavior. So does that relationship also translate to marmots? And so another former rockstar student of mine, Madison, used a few different measures of the individual's social behavior to explore this relationship between sociality with a dozen gut microbes known for physiological, immunological, behavioral associations in laboratory rodent systems. And so I'm just going to share with you two of these results. So again, on our y-axis, we have measures of how social an individual are. So the more we go up the axis, the more social that individual is. And on this first one, we have clustering coefficient, which is how cliquey an individual is with their direct partners. And then on our other y-axis, we have embeddedness, which quantifies how central and how well connected that individual is. So really embedded individuals, like the center of a star. Everybody has to interact with a very embedded individual. And so on our x-axis here, we have the abundance of Streptococcus, which is a pathogenic genus of bacteria. It's related to strep throat in humans. And so we found that greater abundance of this strep throat-related bacteria had a modest relationship with decreased sociality. And so perhaps we can interpret this as more sick marmots, or marmots that were once sick and now have higher abundances of this bacteria in their gut, or potentially less connected and less social in their groups. And so this could be due to social withdrawal, where the sick individual is engaging less in social behavior, which if you've ever had strep throat before, I don't think you wanted to interact with anybody for a few days. Or this could be due to social avoidance, where other individuals are avoiding the sick marmot. So we don't know exactly what the mechanism behind this is, but we know there's a relationship between the guts, the microbiome in the gut, and then an individual's social behavior. So we know individuals and groups are socially variable, and thanks to Carla and Madison, we know a little bit about what are some of the drivers of this social variation. And thanks to previous work done in this lab, we know that social behavior is in part genetically heritable in this species, to the tune of 11 to 22%. And so another way of saying this is that marmots have a genetic predisposition to their sociality, that sociality is part heritable, it's partly genetic, it's not just the product of their environment. And of course, we know a lot about the fitness consequences of individual level social behavior, and that generally more social and connected individual marmots experience mostly fitness costs. Marmots are weird. And so namely, more social marmots have fewer offspring, they're less likely to survive hibernation, and they overall live shorter lives. And so again, these are different measures of fitness, how important. These are really important things in the wild. And so there are also some benefits, such as more social individuals being more likely to survive summer, and more social yearlings being less likely to disperse away from where they were born. But overall, more social marmots are an unhappy marmot. And so while we know marmot sociality influences fitness, exactly how does it influence fitness? And because marmots are such a tasty snack, predators perceive and how marmots will perceive these predators is an important question to ask how they're managing their time. If you spend all your time up on your rear legs looking for predators, you're spending no time eating, and it's get fat or die. And if you're not eating, you're not getting fat. And then that's not going to work out for you. And so my former student Tally found that the more social individuals perceive less risk from an approaching threat, that these more social marmots perceive a higher social security and spend more time out of their burrow when being approached by a threat. And so there's a certain element of being well connected and having friends makes you feel a little more confident. And so while being a social marmot means less offspring and shorter lives, being a social marmot does mean better detecting predators and feeling a sense of social security. And so it's really a balancing act of asking, do I even have a chance of reproducing if I'm in a fox's mouth? No. And so while it may reduce my reproductive success in the long run, at least I can have any reproductive success. So we know sociality is variable, we know it's heritable, and we know a lot about the fitness consequences of an individual marmot's social behavior, that these marmots are weird. However, sociality is more complex than just how many friends we have or how often we interact with them. And so by product of interacting with others, we form social groups. And so how do these social groups influence us? How are these groups structured? And this may impact us as well. And so think about your own social groups. Think about your ski club. Think about your book club. Think about your family or your work group. And how are these groups influencing you as an individual by being a part of them? And so much like individual social behavior that we've focused on thus far, that we can quantify with social network analysis, we can also quantify a group's social structure using the same tools. And that enables us to ask, how reciprocal is a group? How polarized is a group? How breakable, how homogeneous, how connected or sparsely connected is a group? And so we can ask about how social you are and how this impacts you, and we can ask about how social your group is and how this impacts you. But of course, these two levels of sociality are fundamentally nested, like most biological traits, social or not. And in nested structures, the levels may feed back to influence each other, either linearly or non-linearly. And so for sociality, individuals may change who they socially interact with or how frequently, and that might restructure the whole social group at the group level. And changes in the group and social structure may disproportionately harm or benefit some individuals within the group, resulting in changes in the distribution of individual social behaviors. So said simply, individuals structure social groups, and these social groups feed back to influence patterns of individual social interactions. And so because these individual and group levels of sociality are nested and they feed back to influence each other, natural selection at one level is very likely affecting the other level, whether that be directly or indirectly. And so we have to ask, which level of sociality, the individual or the group, is natural selection really acting at? And because it's cyclical, it can be quite difficult to figure out. And so that poses the same question. Of all these results in all these mammals, they're all on the individual level. We know very little about how the sociality of a group impacts each individual within that group. And because these two levels of social organization are nested, we have to ask ourselves, how much of all this selection that we've seen at the individual level is actually selection at the group level that's just being detected in the individual level? And so in other words, is this why marmots are weird? Because if being more social as an individual is mostly bad, maybe living in a more social group is where the benefits lie. And so in order to more comprehensively understand the evolution of social organization in animal societies, including our own, we can't just ask questions at the individual level, and we can't just ask questions at the group level, but we need to quantify these two levels simultaneously at the same time in order to partition this natural selection among these two levels relative to each other. And so that's where my favorite thing in biology comes in, multi-level selection. And so multi-level selection is just like the regular old natural selection that you learned about in high school, except where traits that increase the fitness of an individual, such as survival or reproductive success, those are selected for and propagated through time. If blue was the coolest thing, my skin would be all blue. That's natural selection. Multi-level selection says the same thing, but additionally posits that natural selection can occur at multiple levels all at the same time. So it's just adding more complexity to the idea that we all know. And so multi-level selection is a framework for understanding the vast and complex selective forces acting on individuals in this vast and complex world. And so this might be sociality, or this might be selection acting simultaneously on the level of the gene and on cells and on groups of cells, or on individuals and on social groups, or from microbiomes into social groups. And so multi-level selection has been documented as a driving force for the emergence of the first multicellular organisms to the structure of entire ecosystems in human cultures. And so in these nested levels of social organization, like sociality, multi-level selection might be a more comprehensive and accurate way to understand natural selection as it accounts for these multiple levels relative to each other. And so to understand the weird and fun social lives of the yellow-bellied marmot, we need multi-level selection, where we can ask about how social you are and how that impacts you, and we can ask about how social your group is and how that impacts you. And then we can ask these questions at the same time. So this is the point of the talk where I pull up a math equation, so I hope you go home and think, wow, this guy's really smart. But it's not that complicated. I just made it look all fancy. Really what this equation is doing is fitting a few measures of how social an individual is and a few measures of how social the group is, and asking how all these things influence an individual's fitness, how social it is, and its reproductive success. And we fit some additional variables in here as well, such as group size and body weight to control for extra variance. But really what this is asking is we have our individual measures, we have our group measures, we're looking at them at the same time, so we don't get that feedback, but we can really parse this out and begin to understand. And so in short, these models are asking about multi-level selection for the individual and the group levels after controlling for other biologically relevant variables. And so if we find selection, it's within the context of the system and not just some data mess up and not just in isolation. It's within the context of the yellow-bellied marmot. So we did find multi-level selection, and perhaps unsurprisingly, marmots are still weird. And so we found that there is both positive and negative selection for how social an individual marmot is, and there's both positive and negative selection for how social marmot groups are. And so this depends on the specific type of fitness measure. So our individual measures up here at the top, we found that they were related with whether or not you weaned an offspring, so whether or not you had any reproductive success that year. And our group level measures were only associated with whether or not you survived hibernation. And so this is context dependent, because why make it easy, marmots? But here's what I think this means, and I think it means that there's a balance to how social a marmot individual wants to be. You don't want to have a lot of friends, but you want to be close enough to everyone that you can hear them call. And so that's what this measure is degree. You don't want a lot of friends, but you want to be close to everybody else in your group. And so you don't want to be in a group that's super well connected, but you also don't want to be in a group that's going to fracture apart into smaller groups. And so the key takeaway from all of this is that marmots want to go to the party, but they want to stand in the corner and not interact with anybody at the party. Marmots want to go to the seminar, but they want to sit in the back of the seminar and not interact with anybody. And so marmots want to be a part of the group to help hear and detect predators, to hear alarm calls, and to share body heat in winter, but they don't want to be super social, and they don't want to go out and forage together. They want to spend their time getting fat for hibernation. They don't want to spend a lot of time interacting with each other. And I can feel that. If I'm going to the restaurant and eating my pizza, you don't have to come up to me. It's okay. So this analysis also can tell us how strong the selection is at each of these levels. And what this analysis suggests is that selection is stronger at the group level. And so if you're a marmot, your social group matters slightly more than how social you are as an individual. And so additionally, these results not only suggest that multi-level selection occurred in the wild, but that there's this antagonistic multi-level selection within each level and between each level. And so, in other words, there's selection for being more social as an individual, being counteracted by selection for being in a less social group, and vice versa. Because again, the marmots don't like to make understanding them easier. And so this antagonistic selection, both within and between social levels in both directions, could increase the rate of an evolutionary response, or it could flatten or constrain the overall evolutionary response. And so personally, I think what's happening here is this antagonistic multi-level selection and all this goobly jupe of complexity in their social world is flattening their overall evolutionary response. And so remember, yellow-bellied marmots are the weird ones. And so this antagonistic multi-level selection might provide an example for why sociality is not as largely beneficial in this species as compared to all this other species on this list. And this flattening or restraining of the overall evolutionary response might also explain why sociality is not as heritable, as genetically heritable in this system as it is in others, like rhesus macaques and in humans. So if you remember earlier, I mentioned it was about 11 to 22% heritable genetically in marmots. It's 50% in humans. It's up to 80% in rhesus macaques. And so this complex mess of multi-level selection in all these different levels might explain why marmots are weird and why it's not as genetically heritable in this species. It's also important to note that all the species on this list are more gregarious than the marmots. And so given at least 2 of these species we know have more genetically heritable social behaviors, perhaps we can predict that there's more aligned and more positive multi-level selection, that everything's pointing in the same direction in these more social species. So, I've thrown a lot at you. In summary, because the levels, I want the few takeaways. Marmots are weird, in case you haven't gotten that from me yet. Get fat or die, so you can have that ice cream tonight. Climate change is complicated, so is marmot sociality. It's both good and bad for marmots for climate change. Multi-level selection kind of helps us make sense of how marmots are weird, but also confuses me even a little bit more. And I want you all to take away, other than my math equation, to take away how do your social groups impact you? How social you are and how many friends you have and how often you're interacting with them definitely impacts you. But how about your groups? And how can we structure better groups in our social worlds to make our lives and our fitness all the better? And so work like this would not have been possible without field stations like Rumble in Colorado, like SNARL and Valentine right here in our backyard. And so I especially want to thank the staff of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in Colorado for their help in keeping long-term projects like this alive and supported for as many decades as is required to ask these really big evolutionary questions. And so the fact that all of you guys came to a field station today to learn about a talk, or to learn from a talk about research done at a field station is pretty cool. Yes, I'm a field station nerd, so I think it's extra cool, but I'm very appreciative that everyone's come to a field station to spend their evening. And while there are far too many people to thank both at the individual and the group levels, I want to thank Dem Blumstein, who currently runs the project, thank Carol and the whole VSER team for hosting me. This is super cool. And I want to thank you all for attending and listening, and I'm eager for your marmot questions.
We do have time for questions, and what I'm going to do, because we record each of these talks, is so that we can hear your question. I'll just pass the mic around. If you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll pass you the mic.
Simple question. Do you see an interaction whereby male marmots tend to favor certain female marmots and not just disperse themselves equally, but tend to be more consolidated with 1 or 2?
Oh yeah, if I go back to the first photo here, this is Dandelion. He's huge. He's like 7 or 8 kilos. Yes, we name them because we have to know who's interacting with who. And these are Dandelion's 2 favorite females. And so I forget their names. I'm very sorry. I've learned a lot of marmots. And so the males do have these preferential relationships. The males run away basically as soon as the pups emerge, but they come back a little, and they just hang out in the hills right above. And they'll come back and they'll hang out a little bit. And you can see they're come just to their favorite females that they reproduce with year after year after year. And the babies will crawl over the dad. They're like, Dad's here. And they'll crawl for like 2 minutes, and Dad's like, and he runs away. He spends about 2 to 5 minutes, and he runs away. So the males, not great. Not great parents, but they do have preferential relationships for sure. Marmots have best friends. Carol's got the mic.
What's the average overwinter survival rate, just as a first part of the question?
Yeah, that depends on the winter, because that's my favorite answer to all questions, because it's a non-answer. It can be high in some good winters where they dig themselves out and they had a good blanket, and it can be well above maybe 70%. But bad years, it could be below 40. So it
But
varies.
even on a good year, about a third of the marmots are just like dying in their sleep.
Yeah.
In their burrows.
Yeah.
Whoa. Okay, that's intense. And then the ones who don't make it, how come they failed to get fat enough? Like, what happened that they weren't eating enough food?
Do you want a PhD in marmots?
No, I'm already getting one in something unrelated. Two would be too much.
You'd be surprised by how little we know even after 63 years of studying marmots, and these kind of simple questions of really asking, what's the mechanism behind something? What's the real reason behind something? It's good job security for me and for people who study animals, because you're like, it's always changing and it's really hard to understand. Part of what I think is it's time budgets, that if you're spending all your time interacting, you're not spending as much time eating. If you're a low-ranking male, unlike dandelion's going to be harassing the crap out of you. And so you're spending a lot of times avoiding dandelion so you don't get killed. And so because the males will duke it out and push each other off cliffs and down into rivers. Again, males, not great. And so if you're a younger male, you're spending a lot of time doing that and trying to sneak around the bigger male. And so maybe you're not spending as much time eating as well. And then there can also be all sorts of physiological and hormonal things as well. We think lots of predators, more stress, more time looking, less time eating. It's a time question, kind of like humans. Marmots also don't have any time. Work at you. I see you.
So I was just going to ask, because I don't know as much about mammals. In comparison, marmots are weird. Not that there's anything wrong with weird. But looking at that chart that kept going over, mainly primates, and then you have, some of the species that we consider, like whales, things that we consider more intelligent and stuff. How do they compare to other rodents? Because I don't know a lot about the sociality of other rodents. And so trying to get the equal footing. Are they weird like other rodents? Or are they weird in comparison to a lot of the mammals that we think of and think of socially?
That is a great question. And that's a comparative anatomy. That's a comparative question because, yeah, you're right. I'm showing no other really rodents on this list. The rocks hierarchy up at the top, that is a rodent. The more social they are, the better they are off. Ground squirrels, more social they are, the better off they are. So yeah, marmots are also weird in the rodent world. That's a great question. And again, nothing wrong with weird. I got a question up here.
Two questions. What is their, sort of in a sense, their reproductive timing? Are they breeding before they go into hibernation? I study bats and reproduction in bats. So, or are they, so they don't have to go out right away when they want to eat and then also worry about mating and producing young? Yeah. And then, again, getting back to, are there any other comparable studies done with this sort of socialization and networking in other rodents?
Great question. So marmots, they wake up and they dig themselves out of the snow. And the males usually wake up first and dig themselves out, and then they run around the snow, and it's really easy to watch them then because it's just a brown blob running across a white landscape. And they're trying to dig the females out because they mate as soon as they wake up from hibernation. Woohoo! And then the pups will emerge 30 to 60 days later. So usually this is a pretty similar elevation to Rumble. Rumble's up at 9,500 feet, so it might be just a little earlier here. But usually around June, July is when the pups will emerge. And then the pups eat as much as they can and try not to get eaten. And then they'll go down for hibernation. And so they wake up, they mate, the pups will come up. Right before the pups come up, those yearlings, the ones born last year, will disperse and run away because they don't want to get beat up by dandelion. And then they all go down for hibernation, roughly around the same time, late September, early October. What was your second question? Sorry?
No, in terms of other rodent species, I know some of the antelope ground squirrels and other ground squirrels have been studied a lot. So I was just wondering how they fit into that picture.
That's a great question. Yeah, so how do other rodents fit into this picture? And so I think pika is probably a fun example because we all know and love pika. Pika don't hibernate. And so they stash food. That's why you always see them in these cute photos carrying food. And they stash food in their burrows, and then they stay awake all winter, which is crazy. And so there's different strategies to facing different harsh environments. Carol has a lot of problems, and so she has a lot of friends. That's one strategy. One strategy to dealing with a harsh winter is to hibernate. Another is to not and stock up on food. And so even just within the rodent family, it's hard to make comparisons, let alone what I tried to convince you today across all these crazy species from aquatic to terrestrial. So again, the answer is, it depends.
No, I mean, that's an incredible data set you're dealing with and a part of.
We're very lucky. Another plug for field stations.
What are the predators here for the marmots?
Golden eagles, foxes, coyotes, mountain lions, badgers, dogs, a little bit of everything. So at Rumble, we don't allow dogs, which means Rumble's a very sad place because the dogs will chase the marmots, and just that scent will give off that kind of scare the marmots into behaving differently. So, a marmot's a giant like loaf of bread. Like if something can eat a marmot, they're going to try to eat a marmot. It's a good question.
What are their foods?
So marmots are what I like to call opportunistically omnivorous. So if they stumble upon meat, they'll eat it. But no one in the wild just leaves meat lying around. And so marmots mostly eat flowers. And so they eat also. They're very cute when they stand up on their hind legs and they're just like chewing on food. But it's a lot like they'll walk and they'll take 2 bites and they'll look up because they're terrified. And then they'll take 2 bites and they'll walk and they're terrified. Try doing that the next time you eat your Wheaties in the morning and look up every 2 seconds. You're like, eating's not so fun.
You want to pick somebody?
Oh, this is your job.
Okay.
My question pertains to Rumble. I've
Yeah.
spent time around there. I understand there's a guy there, I think his name was Bill, who's kept really close weather records for over 50 years. Snowfall, temperature, daily. Were you able to use that in your studies there?
All of that data comes from Billy. So Billy Barr first visited Rumble in 1972, and Billy said, screw Rutgers, I'm going to stay here. And he's never left. Billy is the owner. So Rumble is this kind of unique field station that in the silver boom, in the gold boom in Colorado in the 1880s, it was a population of 1,000 people. It was called Gothic Colorado. And then the subsequent bust a few years later, that town with all these cabins became vacant, and some nerdy scientists went, I have an idea. And so that Rumble was founded in 1928. And then Billy moved in 1972 and never left. He's the only year-round resident of Gothic, Colorado. So if you are interested in Billy Barr, just look up Billy Barr. He doesn't capitalize either B. It's lowercase b for Billy Barr. And you'll find all sorts of videos. The people love him. He's a lovable character. He's got a big old beard. He skis hundreds of miles a year. And he likes to live alone. So yeah, Billy Barr collects daily weather data.
That must have been invaluable for your marmot research.
So Rumble is a kind of a powerhouse for climate research because how many other places have that type of twice a day, every day, dude never goes on vacation for 50, 60 years. And so we used some of that to measure when winter ends and how long winter is and when snow melts because Billy's out there every day, twice a day. Go look up a video. I should have had Billy in here. Look up a video of Billy Barr. You'll get a crack out of it.
And this isn't related to social, but in Mineral King, we hear these rumors of marmots everywhere, cars being wrapped, fenced areas. Why? I mean, is that prevalent everywhere, or do we just hear about it, or is it an environment? What's different there with here and marmots attacking cars?
If you'd like to come out and look at my car after this, we can go through lists of marmot damage. My car thinks its tires are at 0 PSI because the marmots ate the tire pressure sensors. If you have a Subaru, the wire, the cable connecting your transmission fluid is made out of some plastic with a vegetable-based oil. The marmots like vegetable oil, and so they're chew right through it. And so the number of cars we've had to see tone down the valley in Colorado because of marmots. So I don't think it's just Mineral Valley. It's a little bit of everywhere. And so really what these marmots are doing when they crawl into these engines is you got to think these dark, hidden, protected things are parked all over this open parking lot landscape. And if an eagle shows up, or a coyote's chasing you, they're a great place to run in and try to hide. So they use car engines as these temporary escape burrows. And so then they stay in there and they're terrified. They don't want to die. And so that's why they're really, really stinking hard. If you're open your hood and you're hitting it with a stick or pouring water on it, doesn't work. The best solution to get them out is to open your hood because it's no longer dark and feels safe, and you let them leave. So if you need to be in a rush, sorry. People wrapping their cars, which maybe you've seen, they drive over a tarp and bungee it all around. That is the only solution I've seen that works, as much of a pain in the butt as that solution is. And so marmots are using them as escape burrows, and they use that everywhere.
Yeah, that last question kind of answered half of it, because I've seen the marmot wraps at Mineral King many times, and I've wrapped my car sometimes I haven't had a problem. But I wanted you to answer more about their senses, like sense of smell and their vision. I've always assumed they're not nocturnal, which is great for backpackers, because they're always, I'm in the high country all the time, and I don't have to protect my stuff at night. And so if you can tell me more about their night vision and their senses of what they rely on more for survival.
Yeah, so marmots have great eyesight because they're constantly looking up and looking around for predators. And so they can see a coyote blending into the landscape and trying to traverse and find them. So their eyesight's quite good. And their vocal cords are very good, as you've all probably heard. Do you want to do it? Are you going to do it? I was trying to trick him into doing a marmot call. You've heard a marmot call, right? A high-pitched scream, and they're screaming, there you go, you got a marmot in here. And so that's quite good. Their sense of smell, not that good, because that's usually a thing for food, and they eat everything. They eat all the flowers. And so it's not hard for them to find food. But their eyesight's quite good. And then they're not out at night. The number of texts I've gotten from people who, a marmot ate my tent. When you study marmots, any marmot problem is your problem.
The chart that you showed with like the macaque and the lynx and the mammals, can you explain what the numbers to the left of the female and male signs are, and if there's any significance to the differing sizes and colorings of those symbols?
Yeah, so I hate to break it to you, those numbers are just the citation number. So if you go to read the paper, I should have cropped that out for the talk. That's a good point. I accept all feedback on how to make this talk better. Right, those are males and female. And so I've blown through, you think I've been shown complexity in this, I've blown through a lot of complexity where some of these results are just males, some of these results are just females, some just adults. And so that's what that's trying to show, is whether or not these effects are seen in just males or just females. And then you're correct, how large these symbols are represents how strong those relationships are. And then the coloration is just trying to show taxonomy, who's related to who, right? These are all primates.
What's the coloration on the male-female? You have different coloration, the orcas and the...
Oh, how those are lighter?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Okay.
I'm humble enough to know. I don't know. I'll read the paper again for you. It's the least I can do.
So I was wondering about how many marmots hibernate together and how many are in burrows together. Is that different, and what that looks like?
Yeah, so you're hitting on my soft spot, which I hope no one would hit on, is that half of their lives we have no stinking clue. What they do underground, we know very little about. And that's like half their day. They come out early in the morning, they're like birds, they're out at dawn, and then they're out at dusk. So the whole middle of the day, they're under the ground. All winter, they're under the ground. All night, they're under the ground. What's happening underground? That's a great question. So we know some marmots, especially in the alpine of the Himalayas and in Europe, they definitely hibernate together. We know some of our yellow-bellied marmots in Colorado hibernate together, and there's both pros and cons to that. Pros of sharing body heat, so your burrow gets warmer, but also if one wakes up and bumbles around the burrow, it wakes everybody up. And when you get woken up from hibernation, your heart rate elevates, which means you're burning more fat, you're burning more energy. And so, again, it depends on whether or not social hibernation is good. And so they can hibernate alone, or they could hibernate in their whole social group, which can be a dozen or 30. And so it's a lot of warm bodies in a burrow. But we want to know more about what's happening underground. So we're trying to get money to do a project where we're going to radio collar them. And they have these like proximities. So like if you tap your phone to pay, that same technology we want to put on marmot collars so we know who's interacting with who, like who's coming face to face underground. And how different is their social network and their social profile above ground versus underground. Do you want a marmot PhD? I'm giving them away. Plenty of project ideas. You're putting in the work today, Carol.
Couple more? We don't want to wear you out, Connor.
Oh, I can talk about marmots all day.
Let me know.
Careful what you wish for, people.
Did you have one? Yeah. Okay.
Hi. I'm thinking about territory. I used to see lots and lots of marmots when I spent a great deal more time in the backcountry. And what's his name? Dandelions, sons and grandsons. How far are they going away to create their own, house? And or do they still hang around in the same area even though the dominant male doesn't seem to want to be around them?
So that depends how sneaky you want to be. If you're a real sneaky male, you might try to hide behind a tree when dandelions walking around and try to dodge them. And so the story of dandelions is actually quite sad because we studied, these are kind of all the colony areas we study. And so marmots are great to study because birds fly away from you and they work in 3 dimensions. Marmots have zip codes and they only ever live in one area. So you can always go back and find the same individuals. And so this is one of our colony areas. This is actually right where all, like the 50 cabins that make up Rumble is. And so this was all dandelions as far as his eye could see. He owned it all. And then he had a kid, and that kid took this half a town and pushed dandelion just to this half a town. Sorry, vice versa. His kid took up here, up on this hill, and then dandelion was subjugated just to down here. And then his grandson took this part of town, and then dandelion just lived on one tiny little cabin with one female holding on Stitches. I finally remember her name. And they had this happily little life here until one of his sons probably pushed him off a cliff. Marmots are really mean. And so that depends. And so dandelion held it. He held all of town for 2 or 3 years. But then as he got older or a bigger male dispersed in, there have these competitions. But when they disperse, if you're born here, you're dispersing to the other valleys. You're getting the heck out of Dodge because it's really hard when you disperse to find a new home. They don't really dig new burrows. They're really taking over. And so the females will disperse and they'll find an empty burrow and they'll just wait a day and a male will show up. And then they'll try to set up these new colonies. But they're not everywhere. Like why we don't have any sites here is because they're not really here. They're way up on the slopes, but I don't want to hike way up on the slopes. So these are really the only spots they're found at the bottom of the valley. So you'll see them on your hikes, but you won't see them everywhere on your hikes.
There's some territories that are
Mm-hmm.
How is it that they do, or do they, if they're asleep for 8 months of the year, I would imagine if I didn't move for 8 months, I would have insane muscle atrophy. Do they not I just imagine waking up like totally emaciated and unable to move practically. That's obviously not the case if they're going to make it right away.
They definitely look haggard. When they dig out, they just sit at the edge of the burrow, like with a hangover, and they're like, holy cow, that sun's really bright. But in terms of muscle atrophy and those types of physiological questions, we know nothing. So when you're done with this PhD and your first Marmot PhD, you can do your third Marmot PhD. Again, those types, we've done a lot of organismal level things, right? Individual level questions, asking about marmot social behavior, asking about hibernation, but we've done very little genetically, we've done little physiologically and immunologically. So I avoid the lab at all costs. So that's a good question.
You want to take one more, Connor?
I can take as many as you got.
Okay.
Testing. It works. One of the questions that was just asked answered my question, except what's the largest number of marmots in a group that you have found, and how does it compare to the smallest number?
Well, the smallest number is 2, because it takes 2 to make a group. And then the largest number I ever saw was 31, which is a lot of marmots trying to share a little bit of space. But the largest group we had in our database was 52. But here's another point where I'll be honest, is what even is a social group? Like, how do you actually quantify what a social group is? I have like 6 different definitions for a social group. I've used just one throughout this talk, and I didn't tell you what that definition was. But it comes back to this same basic question of like, that was my favorite thing during my PhD. My advisor would be like, cool, but yeah, your research is interesting. But what's a social group? And you're like, cool, see you tomorrow. Right? Is a social group who you interact with the most? Is it only your direct partners? Right? Is someone a part of your social group if you only interact with them online? And so the question of how big is a social group, based on our definition, 50-something, but maybe our definition's wrong, and it could be 1,000 in a group. And so that's a hard question to answer. So I'll give you another humble non-answer.
Are yellow-bellied marmots do they really have yellow bellies?
Not all of them, which is a disclaimer. They have a lot of variance in their coloration. And so pretty much all the photos I shared in this talk are yellow-bellied marmots, right? So you can kind of see some yellow that would transmit down to the belly on this guy, except that's a yellow-bellied marmot. What gives? luckily, where we study them, there's only one marmot. So if you see a marmot, it's a yellow-bellied marmot, no matter how weird it looks. If you get further up into these areas where they overlap, wherever that map went, that's where it's going to get a lot more difficult, especially these tiny little areas where these two marmots, the Vancouver marmot and the Olympic marmot, look very similar. So luckily, here, just yellow-bellied marmots, no matter the color of its belly.
Is there a temperature range or a elevation range where they typically live? When I would go hiking here, I would think of them at 11,000 feet, up in some cliffs somewhere. But it looks like in your picture, they were down in the valley.
Yeah, so that picture is a little bit of a disclaimer because down in the valley is 9,500 feet. We're way up there in Colorado. So Gothic right here is 9,500 feet, and this is a 13,000-foot mountain called Gothic Mountain. But in North America, the yellow-bellied marmot is found from like 4,000 feet up to the top of Mount Whitney. And so they're a little bit of everywhere. They're quite plastic. They're quite flexible. They're quite robust, as much as I make fun of them. Like, they live in a lot of places. But you'll never find them in a forest. You're only going to find them in places clear of brush and talus fields, because talus fields are easy to dig in and have a burrow, and you can see really far. And when you're a loaf of bread, you want to be able to see really far, and you can't do that in a forest. So you find them in open spaces from 4,000 feet up to Mount Whitney.
And no temperature limitations?
They do. I mean, if down at 4,000 feet, it can get warm. And so I don't think they're like in the Owens Valley, unless anyone's seen them down there. But in Idaho, a little further north, they'd be down lower because it's still a little bit cooler. But they can deal with hot temperatures mostly by hanging out underground where it's much cooler during the day.
Okay, Connor, I think we could talk marmots all night, but
Happily.
we'll let you wrap up here. And then, of course, if any of you have questions and want to come up and talk with Connor individually, but I just want to thank you for that presentation, and thanks for coming.